Hi, everybody. Just going to let everyone kind of pile in here and then we'll kick today's webinar off. All right, I see that number jumping up, so let's get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the live webinar, HR Transformation, How a Skills-Based Approach Will Future-Proof Your Organization. I'm Alex Uretsky, Marketing Coordinator for Annex Business Media and Talent Canada, and your moderator for this session. And before we get started here, I just want to extend a big thank you to our sponsor, the Queen's University IRC. Before I pass it over to our speaker this morning, I'd like to take a moment and go over a few housekeeping items. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded, so if for any reason you have to leave early or you miss part of the presentation, a link to the recording will be emailed to all registrants in 24 hours. Secondly, questions can and should be submitted to the Q&A folder at the bottom right of your screen, and all questions will be saved for the end of today's presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Wylie Burke is an innovation consultant, facilitator, and leadership coach. She is the lead facilitator for Queen's IRC's Talent Management and Strategies for Workplace Conflict program. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Wylie for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Alex, and welcome everyone. Good morning. I am so happy you were able to join this morning. I know for those of us who are celebrating holidays at this time of year, we have that long to-do list that we're trying to get through. So I know how busy folks are, and I do appreciate you carving out some time to spend with us today to chat about this whole idea of HR transformation and how a skills-based approach can future-proof your organization. This is a topic that I've been really interested in. It feels like it's sort of live right now. There's a lot of new sort of research and material coming out about this skills-based approach and how it is going to be supportive inside organizations in terms of solving some of those longer term business problems and headaches that we've all been, facing, especially over the last few years. The idea and the concept of the skills-based approach, what's interesting is that it really is about reimagining how we organize our work and how we organize our talent. And so in many ways, it's really about this transformational way of looking at work and turning a lot of those typical, more traditional processes that we're all used to, turning it on its head. And so it's just an interesting conversation to start having and really considering how might we start integrating some aspects of a skills-based approach into our organizations. So that's what we're going to touch on today. We have an hour, so I'm going to do my best to sort of get you started in terms of understanding what are some of those key components of the skills-based organization and really create sort of like a baseline understanding for us to have the conversation and even for you to start bringing this conversation back into your organization. The reality is all of us are doing this to some extent. It's just sort of figuring out how and where. But how do we want to expand the conversation inside our organizations? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those steps that you might want to start thinking about taking. Some of you, as I said, it depends on the journey that you're on right now. Some of you might be further along in that journey than others, but we're going to talk about what are some of those steps to scale up your skills-based strategy and how do you right size that for your organization. How do you apply it to the sort of the biggest problems that you're trying to tackle right now inside your organizations? The other piece to this is understanding what the role of HR is in moving the skills agenda forward, and how are you engaging your business partners inside the organization to help move the needle here. And then finally, we will end, I think we'll have about 10-15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please, as we're moving through the webinar today, if you have questions, make note of that and pop it in the chat, as Alex mentioned, and he's going to help moderate that discussion. It's funny doing a webinar. I'm so used to sort of having an interactive approach in having these kinds of conversations. So I do look forward to hearing from you at the end so that we can kind of have a bit more of a dialogue. So what I wanted to start with too is what is our sort of problem statement? And when I frame this as HR challenges, I mean, this is really, what are the business challenges that we are faced with today? They're not only related to HR, but I think all of us are familiar with the skills gap and the challenges that have started to emerge around the skills gap that we're seeing inside of organizations. And um, like the World Economic Forum reports that about 50% of employees will need to be reskilled by 2025. And that is really as organizations are adopting new and different types of technologies. So we need to really understand what are those skills gaps that we need to anticipate. What are the skills gaps that we have inside our organizations today that we may not even be aware of? And so that, as I said, is a headache that is, I think we think of skills as sitting sort of in HR, but it's a challenge that lays, itself across an organization. We know about the talent shortage issues that we've been having. I would say, in the talent management program that we run here at the IRC, this is probably one of the bigger headaches that organizations are sort of managing right now. We know that, voluntary attrition just exploded through the pandemic. And so we're still trying to catch up to that and figure out how do we manage some of these shortages. And again, when we're thinking about the skills-based organization, it's really interesting to think about how applying a skills-based approach can actually tackle some of the talent shortages, but also the retention issues and engagement issues. So it does serve a number of different purposes inside organizations. Burnout, again, I mean, this has been a topic that comes up all the time in the talent management program is, that how we've moved into this hybrid work environment, and we've taken our work at home with us, and there isn't necessarily the same kind of boundaries around our work life and our home life, and how organizations are really being asked to provide sort of better wellness supports inside the organization to help manage some of that burnout. And how do we create a more employee-centric environment where folks can thrive? The other piece here, again, as I just mentioned around hybrid work, organizations are still trying to figure this out. What this new normal is, how do we manage folks inside this hybrid work environment? What are the sort of long-term plans around this? And the policies and procedures and based on role, some roles it's easier to have folks work in this hybrid environment, other roles not so much. And so we see the tension that emerges inside organizations around some of that as well. Agility, again, coming out of the adoption of new technologies, the change in what our customers and even our employees are looking for. So organizations are feeling that pressure of needing to be more agile and flexible and building that mobility inside organizations, right? So that you can move your talent to the places where your talent are going to be most effective inside your organizations. And one of the things we're going to talk about are some of the structural issues that can get in the way of being able to do that really effectively, just by virtue of how our organizations have been structured and organized, and what that means in terms of building barriers to that increased agility and mobility. We just talked about retention issues, and then in terms of EDI, organizations over the last few years have really prioritized creating more equitable work environments, trying to address bias and correct, unequitable processes and policies inside organizations to create a deeper sense of safety and inclusion at work. I mean, this is a new journey for a lot of organizations and a very painful one for many employees. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how adapting to a more skills-based approach becomes a more equitable work environment and creates opportunity, democratizes opportunity inside organizations. And then again, with engagement, we've talked a little bit about this in terms of the burnout piece. But one of the interesting things around the skills-based organization is when we're really tapping into the individual's innate skills and interests, how that really feeds a sense of sort of well-being and engagement inside an organization and a sense of purpose, which again, we know there has been, more pressure on organizations, right, to provide an environment for people where they feel like they're connected to a sense of purpose and vision. So this, I like to think of it in terms of sort of a problem statement. Each one of these is, I think of it as like a mini fire inside your organization, right? And if these things are not addressed, that fire is just going to expand, and it sparks other issues, right? And these things can collapse on each other. And so there's no sort of silver bullet, easy answer to solving all of this. So I'm certainly not going to say that a skills-based approach is the only way to approach all of these sort of challenges. But what I will say is it does build in some flexibility to help work through a number of the challenges that HR folks and organizations are feeling today. So I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of skills, but also the evolution of the workforce, right? And so when we think about this image of the house, in the Industrial Revolution, in that time, organizations were really designed based on principles of efficiency and structure and standardizations, right? This is where we see, and especially in these more established organizations, I think of, my experience working in the banking industry, highly bureaucratic, highly process heavy, right? Based on principles of stability and predictability and job security. And so this is where we come from, right? And inside this sort of structure, we don't, in fact, have a lot of the ability to sort of move and evolve and change. Our work was organized around the job. So the job was really that center component, the job description, your job title, what education do you have, right? So to a large extent, it could be recognized as being very limiting. And so as we've sort of moved, and some of the triggers around this would be around the adoption of new technologies and the speed of the technological change that we're seeing now. And I think, for decades, we've been feeling this sort of tension between the need to be more agile, the need to create more mobility inside organizations and be more adaptable. But the tension exists in the fact that structurally organizations are just not designed to be able to support that. But the pandemic really did, speed this up to a large extent. And so we see, I'm just going to open this slide up a little bit more, how some of these changes, right, around the pandemic. So I'll start there in terms of thinking about, when the pandemic hit and we were all forced to move home very quickly, right? For most of us, we were able to do that. I don't know that seamless would be the word that we would use to describe it, but what we did learn was that we were able to make that shift, and we were able to work from home and do so fairly effectively and fairly quickly, right? And so what that told business leaders is, look, we can adapt, we can pivot and do things in different ways. And so it really opens up the thinking around what are other ways that we can adapt and be more agile and be more quick and shift processes that don't serve us anymore. So we see here again how, technology is a driver of this, market adaptability, that talent competition, the social and political conditions that are putting pressure on organizations as well. And so moving from this sort of concept of, that really sort of structured, bureaucratic approach inside organizations to moving to something, and I see this circle as, this isn't going away anytime soon. And that circle, you're always going to be picking up new things that we need to respond to. And so how do we change the way that we organize ourselves to be more flexible in adapting to all of those things? And so this is where the research is really drawing on this whole concept of putting skills at the center of the work and not so much a job, right? So this is the big concept, is skills become the center of the work. We're breaking down that job and we're shifting over to skills. And so I want to take a minute here to ground us in some definitions around what a skills-based organization is, right? So the skills-based organization, and this comes out of the conference board. The skills-based organization defines how work is accomplished by deconstructing roles and jobs into critical tasks and outcomes, and identifying the current and emerging human skills required to complete the work. For these organizations, skills become the center of the talent strategy in place of or alongside the traditional structure of jobs, and this is enabled by intelligent technology. So what really stands out for me when we're looking at this definition, there's a couple things. There's a focus on what are the problems that we're trying to solve inside our organization? How are we linking those problems to the talent, but not just the talent, but specific skill sets that are going to solve those business problems? So again, what I think of here is that we're becoming a little bit more granular in the way that we're thinking about work. And John Boudreau, who is somebody who's written a book about the skills-based organization, talks about this notion of deconstructing a job description, deconstructing jobs. And that, again, I think is a little bit hard for us to kind of wrap our heads around, because this is how we've organized ourselves in our work, right? So now we need to just think a little bit differently about how we deconstruct the job to make it a little bit more fluid, right? To align those skills and capabilities to the problems that we're trying to solve. So the starting point is always, what is that problem that we're trying to solve inside our organization? So when we're talking about skills, excuse me, skills that, inside these skills-based organizations, the focus is on skills and human capabilities, not jobs and job titles, right? And so I want to just take a minute here, because we're going to talk about the importance of building shared language inside organizations, because we talk about skills, we talk about competencies, we talk about capabilities, and oftentimes those things can be collapsed into each other or used interchangeably. And it's really important that we start to understand how we're differentiating between these things, so that when we are having conversations in our organization, or we're trying to move the needle on taking a skills-based approach, that we're using the right language and that we're building that into the organizational culture. So if we think of skills in terms of, an analogy would be skills, like the ingredients in a recipe, right? So you're looking at flour, sugar, and eggs. When you move into your capabilities, it's the ability to put those ingredients together to achieve a desired outcome. So how are you combining different cooking techniques to achieve that outcome? When we're thinking about competencies could be compared to the chef's ability to execute a recipe effectively. But also, in addition to that, running a kitchen efficiently, sourcing the right ingredients, creating, a diverse menu. So we see, right, when we're moving into skills, we're getting a little bit more granular, and it's sort of like moving out from there. So you've got your skills, your capabilities, and then your competencies. So again, the idea here is to just really start normalizing some of the language, so that we're using the right kind of language inside our organizations as we start, moving into the skills-based sort of strategy and approach. So I thought this was a really helpful diagram that I pulled from the Richardson Consulting Group's website, and I would encourage you, if you're interested, I do have a resource page at the end of the deck here, with a few resources that you can refer to. But the Richardson Consulting Group's page has all kinds of great articles and blogs and tools like this that can help you as you're starting to unpack some of these concepts. And again, I'm not sure in terms of who's on the call today, where you're at in your own journey. So I provide this to you as, again, tools to help you start to really wrap your heads around some of these concepts. So when we look here at this diagram, we see on the left-hand side, the job-based present, and then to the right, the skills-based future. And so I'm not going to go through this in its full detail here, but a couple things, when we're looking at the top here around business strategy, we see, where we are today is the skills strategy really being a part of the HR and L&D strategy. When we're looking to the future, we see this really as part of your business strategy, right? And that's where, when we're talking about building a skills strategy, it obviously sits in HR, but with a lot of support and sponsorship across your organization, because this can't be something that's done in the corner of somebody's office in HR. It needs to be done collaboratively inside your organization. So it's really broadening this out into the organization. The other piece here around talent strategy is the shift from your talent strategy really being centered on your organization, as opposed to the human-centric approach that we're trying to move towards. It's putting that person at the center of the work. It's really elevating and understanding what their skills are. Talent acquisition and management. Selecting based on experience to fit the role. So, this is the interesting conversations I've been having with organizations right now, trying to figure out how to tackle some of those acquisition issues that they're having. And the focus traditionally has been on, somebody's experience or their education, right? And so now it's really looking at what are some of those skills. And so what we see happening now is organizations are actually starting to pull out what those educational requirements have been historically in their job postings and moving to this more fluid skills-based approach, which is what are the skills that you would be bringing into the organization as opposed to just that degree. So we see that, as a shift here. And thinking about skills too, in terms of what are the skills that organizations need today, but what are the questions that we're asking, and how are we thinking about the skills that we need in the future? So again, when we think back to the statistic coming out of the World Economic Forum, and how 50% of jobs, there will be, a requirement for some kind of reskilling or upskilling because of the technological changes that we're seeing right now. How are we thinking about that in terms of building out our acquisition strategies and thinking about, we've got these gaps today, but we also need to think about the jobs that don't even exist inside our organization today. How are we planning for that? And as HR leaders, how are we having those dialogues inside our organization to help other leaders think about that, right? And one of the challenges here is really everybody has felt like this talent acquisition piece, it's like your house is on fire, right? We're just panicked and trying to get people into the organization, let alone being planful and thinking, more broadly about what are they going to bring to the organization over that long term to help sort of future-proof the organization. So talent development, one-size courses and role certification. So, I think of, in my experience working in talent development and doing training inside organizations, generally speaking, training is directed towards leadership, a smaller component inside an organization. We don't develop learning across organizations, so we typically haven't been able to target the employee base, right? So the idea here is, how do we build in learning and creating a sort of a continuous learning culture right? And what are the tools that we need to be able to do that are focused on continually building those skills, right? And reskilling. And how do you build your learning and development, those learning opportunities into the flow of work? And what technologies can you use to help support that? The other piece here that I think is really interesting in the talent development area is around talent hoarding. And this is something that I've seen inside organizations throughout my career, right? When we have great talent on our teams, the last thing we want to do is lose them. And so this shift here that we're seeing in this sort of skills-based future is really about talent stewardship and sharing. And some organizations are actually starting to reward managers who, so for managers who are recognized for having their employees move into different roles in different parts of the organizations, in the organization, leaders are actually being rewarded for those kinds of behaviors, right? It's really about looking at the talent you have and thinking about how could this talent be deployed more strategically across the organization. And that speaks to even the change in what does a leader look like inside this new world? How are we developing our staff, and what are the expectations of leaders in doing that, but in a broader sense, right? Not just developing your staff in terms of their job description, right? It's developing staff in terms of the skills that they need to develop to support the broader organization. So it is a different way of thinking about this. And again, here, when we think about organization and workflow, really shifting from those deep hierarchies and those more complex job architectures into something that is more flat, team-based structured, and the sort of lean job architecture. And we see here, right, we're matching work to skills and interests. So again, this is where we're talking about engagement of employees. How do we make sure that we're tapping into the interests of our employees, right? And making sure that we're building out a career path for employees in a way where they can see their future inside an organization. We as leaders are supporting that. We're creating the type of culture that supports that through having leaders who are really engaged in moving their talent wherever their talent wants to go and wherever that match makes sense. And then technology and data, right? So what are the talent, the databases? What is the technology that exists inside of your organization where you have access to the data that's going to support you? And how do you leverage that? But I think for a lot of us, we don't often know where, because information gets stored in so many different places that we don't know, how to aggregate it, if it's even possible to aggregate it, but also where information is stored in those different places. So that there is this shift too in terms of what is the technology that organizations need to leverage to be able to pull together those skills. What is the skills data out there? And that's not just skills internal to the organization, right? That skills data exists in all sorts of places outside your organization, which I'm going to spend some time talking about now. And so, this is a sort of a concept around powering up your skills-based strategy. And at the heart of this diagram, and again, this comes out of the Richardson Consulting Group's website. So at the heart of this model is the skills engine, right? And so this is where, when we're talking about what is the technology that you need to use to build that skills engine, right? And the technology, as I said, it can source all kinds of different data, right? So this could go out into social profiles, right? Your social media profiles. So we're talking about a LinkedIn, for example, job boards, resume databases, skills vendor benchmarks. So you're really looking at tapping into all of these different places to gather some of that data. You're bringing it in internally, right? You have your employees who could be filling out assessments internally. So, I mean, obviously there's a conversation here around ethics, and, staff being open to and willing to share certain kinds of data. So, that there's a whole journey in terms of understanding the ethics around this data. I think for the conversation today, it's really thinking about the broadness of those data points, where you can access them from, and how do you start bringing them inside an organization in a way that is actually going to help drive what your strategy is or what your skill gaps are, right? How is it highlighting your skills gaps? How is it helping to inform you what you need to be thinking about for the future as well, right? So managing your skills gaps for today, but also thinking about, in 5 years' time, what skills might we need to be bringing in the organization, and what jobs don't we even have inside our organization right now that we haven't even thought of that we are going to need. And so the idea here is that you're really using this kind of data to connect your employees to those opportunities. And one of the engines that will drive this is called a talent marketplace. And I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this concept of a talent marketplace, but the way that I think of it is really almost like having a LinkedIn inside your organization, right? And I'm going to just define this here for us. A talent marketplace matches people to opportunities and their potential roles based on their skills, interests, and preferences. It can also connect employees with experiential on-the-job learning that will give them the chance to learn new skills or practice the ones they're developing. So when we think about a talent marketplace as being sort of like a LinkedIn, it's almost like could be a job board where it's a centralized place for leaders in an organization, for example, to post an opportunity that has come up in their area. And similarly, it becomes a place for employees to go in and post about who they are, what their skill set is, what is their sort of profile, what are their interests, how do they want to develop, where do they want to develop, and then starting to match, look, this employee has these skills, they're interested in developing skills in this area. That's nicely aligned to the work that's happening over here in this side of the organization. So it becomes this hub, right, that connects your talent to the work that's happening inside your organization. So again, this is a much more sort of fluid way for us to be thinking about work to some extent. When we think about this in terms of, talent acquisition strategies, oftentimes we are looking outside our organizations for new talent. What this does is it really unleashes the existing talent inside your organization, that untapped talent that we're not aware of because people have been sort of confined into the box of their job description, right? But how inside that box of their job description, again, when we think about development, we develop people inside their job description, right? We're not developing people in that broader sense of, as we're talking about skills that are meaningful across the organization. So we really want to think about this in terms of moving it from developing or providing those opportunities within, your job description, or we see that that sort of move up the ladder, right? And what skills would you develop to move up that next rung? We sort of want to shift our thinking about that being our end goal and broadening this out a little bit more. And this is a tool that will help organizations do this. So the talent marketplace, again, is an engine to help supporting that skills-based approach inside your organization. And if you don't have this technology, you could even start by using, an internal portal, right? What are those internal pages that you have where you could even start out small and build it, right? And see how it functions inside your organization. So I want to talk about this, when we were talking about the shift from the sort of more traditional structures inside our organizations, that are more higher, more bureaucratic, more process heavy. This is sort of what we're used to seeing, this sort of very traditional org chart, and a very structured way of seeing the way that people would report in through, a group, right, inside an organization. So this in terms of what your organization design would be considered, something that's more traditional bureaucracy. Where we see this moving, and this might look a little scary, but this could be considered a matrix model or a project network, right? Is that you're opening it up again from that more traditional bureaucratic model to something that is a bit more open and fluid, right? Where again, we're talking about centering people inside your organization and their skills. And we're deploying people across the organization based on those things. So it's not about the job, it's really moving towards the skill. So if you were to have, a project, and again, when we talk about scaling this inside your organization, it's sort of like focusing again on what is the problem that we're trying to solve here. And so if you have a project, if we scale this down to, we have an immediate need inside the organization, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What are the skills? Who are the people that we need to come around the table who can come together with their different skill sets, right, and solve this problem? And over what period of time might that take place? So it is more fluid, and some of us have worked in more matrixed work environments where you might have, your home base manager, somebody who's there, who's going to be the person who's managing your annual performance and having those sort of annual performance conversations with you. And then you might have, a project lead who is supporting you on a specific project, right? And so that project lead and your home-based manager should be in communication with one another, right? But as an individual in an organization, you might have a couple different reporting structures there to support you through, if you are working in this sort of skills-based model, they're there and they're supporting you as you're working through that specific project, but you're still anchored somewhere inside the organization. And so this is the idea of really thinking about, restructuring in a way that builds in some more of that fluidity, right? And that would be a matrixed approach or this project network. And so visually, I like this one because I think what's interesting here is we see, there's a magnifying glass, of the person there, right? And then all of their skills that surround them. So this is where we're centering the work, and we're centering our focus is on skills and the humans that employ those skills, and how we're engaging those skills more effectively inside our organization. So I also think about this almost like a gig economy, and I'm gonna share a couple case studies with you so that we can get a sense for how different organizations are actually building in a skills-based approach inside their organization. But it really is this idea of, I come to work every day and I look at what are the opportunities, where are my interests, what projects do I want to be working on, and then I'm deployed based on those interests and my skills. So it is really almost like a gig economy inside an organization. And so when we talk about these case studies, I don't know if folks have followed what Unilever has been doing, but Unilever has really gone ahead with this whole approach around the skills-based organization, and they've created an initiative that's called Uwork. And the Uwork initiative, you can self-select into this. So it's not, people don't have to do it. You can self-select in. And basically, the idea here is that employees that they are on a retainer. So you're a retainer, and then you have X number of hours a month, for example, that you would be working. You still have your benefits. So you still have access to your benefits. you see work in the organization that you're interested in doing, you work on those projects, and it allows for flexibility for employees. So again, when we're talking about opening up flexibility, they wanted to think about their employee base. So when they're thinking about employees who may be sort of millennials who would be interested in having their own side gig, for example. So say somebody wanted to start building out their own business, they still want to be anchored inside an organization like Unilever, and they have a predictable number of hours of work that they're going to be doing with Unilever. But they also want to have the flexibility to go off and build a website and start another project in their own life, so they can organize themselves around some of their interests. They're anchored at Unilever with those hours, and they still have access to benefits. And alternatively, if you've got somebody at Unilever who's decided to take part in this Uwork program, who's closer to retirement, and they want to focus more on mentorship, right? So that they, for X number of hours in a month, they want to provide mentorship to different folks inside the organization. They could choose to do that. So, but the nice thing is here is they are sort of like contractors, but they're still getting the benefits of having, regular pay, and also the benefits like health benefits. So I encourage you to look at, there's tons of information about different things that Unilever's been doing, and what are the different sort of strategies they've been using to support that shift and that change. Dick's Sporting Goods is another example of an organization that, again, when they were sort of looking at succession planning and the talent inside their organization and feeling a little bit concerned about the future, they decided to embark on the skills-based approach. And so one of the things that they started to do, their first step was meeting with senior leaders, so high-performing senior leaders, sitting down and doing an assessment with those senior leaders and finding out, what skills they had that made them successful in their roles. And so they were starting to build out a bit of an assessment and a skills framework through those interviews and those conversations. The next thing they did is they hired a couple vendors to come in to help support this work. And one of the vendors employed technology to figure out what were the skills that were needed in the organization, and what were the skills that they currently had inside the organization. So they were trying to really understand what the gap was there. And then they hired a second vendor to come in and crunch that data for them. So this is the other thing that I think is important, is from a resourcing perspective, a lot of organizations, I mean, this is a huge undertaking, right? If you're doing it wholesale, which I think realistically, it's not something that we can necessarily do wholesale. But if you are looking at doing this sort of wholesale, what vendors can you bring in to support this work? Because it is a huge effort to sort of go in and start, if you're building a skills framework or strategy, how do you do that in a way that's properly scaled? So in the case of Dick's Sporting Goods, they actually brought in vendors to help them do that and do that gap analysis, and then figure out, they built an internal sort of, what did they call it? And I can't remember what they called it, but they built this, the Elevation Hub, where employees could continually go in there and update their profiles, right? So they had this Elevation Hub that was continuing to feed all of that data. So it's something, from an ongoing basis, they were able to build into their organization and use that data regularly. And I think they used Eightfold AI as the technology at the heart of this. So again, exploring what are the different technologies that are available to you out there that you can leverage and bring into an organization, instead of trying to figure this out for yourselves, because it is, it is a big piece of work. And as I mentioned before, for most organizations, data is held in so many different places, right? Whether that's in your HRIS, your learning management system, it could be in your applicant tracking system. If those things aren't integrated properly, and not speaking to each other, you've got tons of data there, but the data itself is actually not supporting you in that sort of more directed way. So Morningstar and ING are a couple other organizations that have gone through, different layers of the skills-based approach. So at Morningstar, there are no longer job titles. The organization is really flat. So Morningstar is an investment firm, and there's only 2 levels of management. And the teams are organized into squads that follow a specific sort of common purpose. And ING in the Netherlands, they reduced their job roles from 85 to 15 as part of their agile transformation. And again, I think it is hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around how you do that, right? And so there would be a tremendous amount of work and thought that would need to go into doing something at that scale. But I think what is interesting, again, for our conversation is just thinking about this in terms of, where are there opportunities inside our organization to flatten a little bit with the purpose of serving agility? So, and part of that is thinking about what the end goal is in terms of if you are going to become a more flattened organization, what is the outcome that you're driving, right? Is it that you want to be more agile and more responsive to your market needs? Is it because you want to focus on product development, right? And you need to have more speed wrapped around what that product development looks like. So you need to be really clear on what the outcome is that you're driving, and how might you do that in pockets inside your organization. So job roles reduced from 85 to 15 at ING in the Netherlands. Those that remained were given greater authority. Employee skills are mapped with the activities that need to be done. So again, it's that mapping and the connection between employees, their skills, and problems that need to be solved inside the organization, as well as interests. What are the interests of the employees in terms of their own development, etc. So we're talking about scaling this, and I've touched on this. How do we do this inside our organization in a way that is achievable, right? And so, we want to start somewhere that I would say, going to the 3R models here: reachable, relevant, and reasonable. So reachable, I think of this in terms of something that you can wrap your arms around, right? So you're not going out, with the most complex, challenging problem that you have in the organization. What would be considered a good pilot project that you could think of? Who are sponsors in your organization, or people who would, buy into something like this, so that you have that support inside the organization to run a pilot, right? And where you're thinking about, what is the relevancy of it, right? What is the business problem that you're trying to solve? What is that compelling story that you want to be able to tell in doing this? And reasonable, right, is something that is achievable. So that's something that you can measure and that you can deploy within a set period of time. Because again, if you're thinking about scaling this inside your organization, you want to be able to tell the story, use data to show what the change, what the hope, what the change you want to be creating inside your organization. And then at the end of your pilot, what was the actual impact as a result of this? So you want to think about this as reachable, relevant, and reasonable. And again, if you're trying to socialize this inside your organization, you want to be able to use language that is stabilizing for folks, because this is going to be so new, right? You want to be able to build language that's going to make people comfortable and make them understand that this is, if you are going to be doing something different, there's a plan around how you're going to approach this. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of HR leaders inside the skills approach. And again, I would say this is really about maybe HR starting the conversation and building that business case, but it's really about getting the buy-in across the organization, right? So that you have people on your side. You can talk about what are the improved business outcomes. And the key here is that we as HR leaders understand our business strategy, right? What are those problems that we're trying to solve? How are we thinking about skills and our talent, specifically in terms of how we are solving those problems, right? And the need here, the driver, is that as an organization, you want to have better skills intelligence, right? You want to have better insight into what your skills gaps are. So these are the kinds of conversations that you're having and leading inside your organization, right? It's that compelling narrative that is going to capture the hearts and minds of other folks inside the organization. You want to be talking about the future skills that we need inside the organization, right? And some leaders need to be nudged in terms of, instead of just focusing on putting out this fire today, and we're hiring somebody based on this job description to solve your problem today, how might we think about this job differently so that not only are we solving the problem today, but we are looking to the future and thinking about what this would mean in terms of some of those future initiatives. So you want to build that business case. The other key component here is around building that common language. And we talked about this when we were talking about the skills, competencies, and capabilities. We want to make sure that we are using the right kind of language. And this is where you have impact in your culture, right? You want to make sure you're using the right language, you're being consistent. And one of the things that I've seen in organizations is this work happens in pockets across the organization, right? So working in learning and development, for example, there were so many, times in my career where all of a sudden you find out that there's a whole learning initiative happening somewhere inside the organization that nobody in HR or learning and development knows about, right? And the way that they're rolling that out in their business, the language that they're using is entirely different than the language that might be used in HR. And so what we want to try and do is, if we're trying to broaden the scope of this work and broaden the scope of how we talk about skills, we need to be more intentional about what is the language of skills that we're using. How are we deploying that language? How are we collectively responsible, right? If we're going to build a skills strategy, how are we collectively responsible for rolling this out in a way that's going to make sense to folks sitting in all corners of the organization? And this also speaks to how, when we're talking about performance management, right? How we're measuring success inside an organization is largely based on the way that we are defining those things. So if a leader in one area is defining it differently than somewhere else, how are we making sure that we're being equitable in terms of how we're measuring success inside the organization? So we want to think about what is that common language that we want to build. And as HR leaders, how do you want to lead that, right? And create that sort of framework for that language. And the last piece here is around redesigning some of those key people processes. And I think about this in terms of, we talk a lot about this in the talent management program that we deliver here at the IRC. And really, how is talent management truly being turned on its head right now? And, when we think about succession planning, and I've talked about talent acquisition, succession planning and using the 9 box, again, I think of that as so stifling inside organizations, right? And generally speaking, how those processes are developed with your 9 box, right? You've got the people, in that vertical who are, whether it's, you're looking at the role, you're like VP of HR, I'll use VP of HR as an example, right? Maybe, in that pipeline, you've got your director of HR and then your manager or senior manager, right? And that creates your vertical and your succession plan. What we're not doing, again, is looking at what are the skills that are interesting to you about that role or driving that role in different ways. Does that skill set only exist in HR? Can you actually look to different areas inside the organization and think about skills in a different way? And how do we approach that differently? So there's an organization out of England called Disruptive HR. And they talk about succession planning in different ways, right? Which is, how do you start interviewing people in that specific area and finding out from them, like, what do they think the future of the role would look like? What do they see as the skills that are benefiting them today, but the skills that they would like to see embedded into their area in the future? Who might some of those people be? So you're really, again, you're broadening that and thinking outside of the sort of, 9-box framework that we typically use around there, around succession planning and workforce planning. So it's really sort of thinking creatively about what those people processes are. How are your people processes actually impeding your ability to drive the outcomes that you want to be driving? Right. And when you really reflect on it, and again, I think scaling it is like, what is the thing that really truly is keeping you up at night? Is it your talent acquisition strategy? Is it your succession planning, strategic workforce planning? What is it about it that's actually keeping you up at night? If you could shed all of the sort of process and structures that are in place that are keeping you constrained, and just imagine a world where you could solve that problem more fluidly, how would you tackle that problem? So the idea is to sort of let go of some of that structured way of thinking, just thinking creatively, and then coming back to it and thinking, okay, how might I now apply some of this to this problem, or talk about it differently inside my organization to be able to exemplify this problem to other people who may not understand it in the same terms. So you just want to think about what are those different people processes that you can start to break apart and deconstruct a little bit to support you in terms of your long-term sort of success. Oh, we're moving along here because I want to provide opportunities for Q&A. So I'm going to leave this here. Workforce optimization. These are things that you want to think about in terms of future-proofing your organization. I've also included in here future planning questions. So these are the things that you want to be asking folks inside your organization. Like imagine it's 2030, what 3 significant changes have happened in your industry? Lead with those kinds of questions, right? It's really going to show your leadership and your vision for the future. A couple of the things that are the biggest barriers to this are legacy mindsets. Like coming out of the research, the biggest thing is just, this is very new, it's very different. People are afraid. So legacy mindsets, you got to change the culture. You need to assess your technology. What technology do you have? What technology do you need to help support this? And then scale your strategy. So start small. You're not going to be able to do this wholesale. But I'm going to open it up for Q&A. You can see here I've added a resource page. Please take a look at some of the links that I've included here. Work Without Jobs is a great book. You can reach out to me. This was, a marathon, or a sprint. So reach out to me if you have more questions. Alex, what do we have in the Q&A?
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Wylie. We got a few questions here. Just so you know, sifting through the chat right now, there's a ton of thank yous for the wonderful presentation. So everybody loved the presentation. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I hope to hear from some of you.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, first question here, a bit of a long one, so bear with me. Again, they stated, I found all this very interesting, but I'm struggling with how the compensation strategy follows. It feels like this is or could result in a return to a more biased individual compensation approach where individuals can be paid significantly different based on skills competency, based on how that is assessed, which could lead to a lack of equity. How is that playing out from what you?
It's a good question. And I think this is where, when we're talking about, looking at those processes inside our organization, how do we think about this from an equitable standpoint, right? And so when you are flattening your organization, you can actually think about that in terms of you can broaden, your compensation scale. But again, as you say, that could lead to bias. But you really want to be looking at those processes and thinking about, how do you apply compensation to, and I would encourage you to look at what Unilever has done, because they've tackled this, right? If you are framing this in terms of you are working as sort of on retainer, what does that actually look like? So if you were going to be working X number of hours in a month, what would a pay scale look like? And again, it would be very different, but you do want to apply that bias lens to it in terms of thinking about your pay structures. I don't think there's an easy answer to that, to be frank.
No, I agree, and I think your answer was quite sound for that question. This one is a little bit more specific, and you might not know the answer for it, but if you do, that's great. It says, what PD courses at Queen's are available to dig into this a bit more?
I would encourage you to come to the talent management program. So this is where we really do a deeper dive. So when we look at talent management, we go into all of those processes and do a deeper dive in terms of like succession planning. How do you apply a skills-based approach? So definitely encourage you to look into that program.
Beautiful. Thank you, Wiley. Another one here. How does leadership evolve or change as a result of the skills-based organization?
Yeah, so I mean, I think interestingly, and this research has been coming up over the last, I would say, 10 years, is leadership really shifting into focusing more on soft skills, right? And the idea with the skills-based approach is that you almost act more as a project leader in this kind of model, where you're really trying to, align your employees to the opportunities inside your organization. So you need to dynamically orchestrate the work, would be a way of sort of thinking about it, right? So how are you thinking dynamically about the talent inside your organization, the skills inside your organizations, the problems that you're trying to solve inside your organization? How do you understand the skills that are going to solve that problem? And how do you map that out? Right. And so it really is about being a connector, I would say, when we talk about a connector manager, you really want to think about it in the context of being a connector manager and a bit more dynamic.
Perfect. Thank you. And then so how would you say you should approach this in a unionized environment?
Yes, this is a question that comes up all the time. Again, not an easy answer here. I think one of the key things to consider here is that you need to engage the union, but you need to make sure that they understand that the objective here is not about replacing jobs through automation, right? It's not about, looking to use technology to deconstruct jobs. We're using technology to help us understand how we need to change the way that we do work. But we want to be able to support employees in terms of their own skill development. So the key there is making sure that the union folks understand what is the driver behind this. You want to make sure they see that you have a learning and development plan and strategy, which is a huge component to this. You want to be able to support your staff. You want to provide them with these learning opportunities and to develop their skills. So in fact, it's more about engaging employees more effectively, essentially. But that's going to, and then, with your collective agreement over time, how do you actually start working through this in your negotiations and your collective agreement and making some adaptations and changes to that? It is a long journey, but I think the key is, how do you start the conversation? How do you start building some of the language so that people are becoming more aware of it, right? Union reps are becoming more aware of what a skills-based organization even means.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like we're running out of time here, so I'll do one more. Um, and yeah, so what would you say are the most effective strategies for identifying and mapping the skills and capabilities of our current workforce in preparation for a shift to a skills-based approach?
So, I mean, skills framework comes to mind there. I think scaling this, right? Because if we're talking about a skills framework across an organization, again, that is a fairly significant activity. But you want to think about what are those skills? And again, if you're scaling it, you want it, look at a pilot project. What are the skills that you need for that pilot project? What skills do you have inside your organization? What skills don't you have that you would want to bring into the organization? And yeah, so start small, think about the skills, think about competencies, think about capabilities, think about how you define those things inside the organization. So you're building a framework that is sort of consistent and a consistent language. And what was, not sure if I got the second part of that. And
Uh,
tools, oh, let me say one more thing before, because I know we have to go. There's lots of tools that are available. I think it's Lightfold. Is it Lightfold? Oh yeah, it's Lightcast, Open Skills. So go to that website because it's a free tool that you can actually go in and you can look and look at the different skills and frameworks. There's all kinds of stuff available to you online to actually start thinking about how you build a skills framework. So I feel like I'm trying to like get as much information in as possible.
you're doing
Short
a
amount of
very good
time.
job, honestly. This has been a very, very informative webinar, and I can't stop getting thank yous in the chat here. Everyone loved the presentation.
Great.
But yeah, unfortunately, we have reached our time for today. Just before I go into our closing remarks, I wanted to once again extend a thank you to Wylie for being here today and giving that amazing presentation. Also want to extend a big thank you to our sponsor, the Queen's IRC. Last and not least, I want to say thank you to the audience for your questions and participation. Yeah, thank you and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great
Thanks,
day.
Wylie.